It was a different world back then. The idea back then that the IMF and others had was the world economy would grow at 3.3% in 2020. The idea now is that it'll probably shrink. And the idea then was that the Indian economy would be growing at 6%. Now it may not be growing. The US economy would grow at 2.5. Now it'll shrink by 2.5. World oil price was $55 a barrel. Now it's $20 a barrel. Unemployment forecasts for the United States now are 17 to 25%. For India, perhaps 24%. Our distinguished panelists will talk about the US-India business opportunities in the context of these shocks: COVID-19 pandemic shock, the demand shock, the supply shock. And to lead this group of distinguished panelists and to moderate the discussion is my good friend, Gunjan Bagla. Gunjan is an author, a consultant, and a lecturer. And please let me turn over the microphone and the camera to Gunjan.
Thank you, Dick. It's an honor and a pleasure to host this, moderate this webinar. I run a company called Amritt, where we help US companies work with Indian companies. And I spent most of last night working late trying to secure about 3 million bottles from India for hand sanitizer to be produced in the United States. And when I woke up this morning, I flipped around and was looking for COVID test kits to be able to send to India because India has 1.3 billion people and will require a fair number of those to be tested. So this is a very real problem and a real opportunity in terms of trade and relations between the world's two largest democracies. The other bit of news that everyone should know about is that today, Prime Minister Modi of India approved the shipment of 29 million doses of hydroxychloroquine, which are produced in India. Produces 70% of that drug, of the world's supply of that drug, and 29 million doses are going to be headed to the United States, reversing a ban that the government of India had placed just a few days ago. So we are actually seeing the partnership play out very, very much live as we are talking today. Trade between the United States and India was only about $18 billion about 15 years ago. Today, it has risen to $150 billion. And the ambition is that it might grow up to $500 billion. But now let's make it very local to our community in Southern California on a number of fronts. And let me step away from trade for a moment. So today, most of us aren't shaking hands anymore. We are performing the Indian gesture of namaste to greet one another. Okay. Today, many Americans who used to frown upon meditation and yoga are using those mechanisms, those practices to reduce the stress that we are all experiencing. That is what I call India Inside. That's what I call India's soft power influencing Western and worldwide culture today. Now, here in Southern California, which is the home of several of the meditators and yogis who came from India and settled down here. So, before we get into business and politics, I think it's important to recognize the cultural connections between the two largest democracies in the world and how they are centered very much on Southern California. Some of you might know that the first Indian American congressman elected to the US House of Representatives was actually elected right here in Southern California in the Imperial Valley, Dalip Singh Sondh, shortly after Indians were allowed to become citizens of the United States in the early 1950s. And then turning to business, a couple of things I wanted to point out. India is the largest owner of the C-17 transport aircraft outside of the US Air Force. The C-17 was built right here in the Boeing plant in Long Beach. And in fact, our panelist, Dr. Ravi Tilak, has something to do with aircraft that we'll get into in a minute. Then you turn to JPL, the Jet Propulsion Lab, and they are running a project which will be the world's most expensive remote sensing satellite. It's called NISAR. And NISAR stands for the NASA ISRO Strategic Aperture Radar. It'll be a remote sensing satellite built by the Indians and working jointly with JPL that will launch in 2022, a $1.5 billion project. So there's many ways that we are collaborating between the two cultures and the two societies. And I want to turn for a moment to look at the university collaborations and ask Dr. Roman Vaskier to tell us a little bit about the university collaborations. He's a professor at UCLA. So would you spend a minute or so, Roman, and tell us what's happening in Southern California?
Yes, thank you, Gunjan. Thank you for this opportunity to speak today, and thank you to the other panelists for joining as well. It's a pleasure to be here. So we at UCLA have a lot of connections with India that we're trying to increase and foster. We have an international institute with a center on South Asia that is very active in bringing Indian scholars to campus and vice versa, sending UCLA scholars to India. And in the school where I teach, the business school, we have a very active India program where we have an almost annual MBA study trip to India that I run, and I bring 40 or 50 students to visit businesses and government organizations, civil society institutions in India. And it's a full course. So students take a course entitled The Business Environment of India, and we're very keen to increase the ties that we have with India. That's the UCLA piece, and I'm sure that Richard would be able to speak more about what USC is doing. I know that it's something that every university is looking at, very closely, and it's also the result of our greater involvement with Indian students. We admit a greater and greater share of Indian students every year, and it's becoming an extremely important export market, you could say, for educational services for us.
Right. And before we go to Richard, I just wanted to mention that while Roman may not look Indian, his parents were actually lived in India and became naturalized Indian citizens. And Roman travels to India several times a year, taking his students there and so on. So very close ties to India personally, professionally, family-wise as well. Dick, do you want to tell us a little bit about USC or and its involvement with India? I know that Ratan Tata was on your university's board of advisors for some time, as was Narayana Murthy, two very famous Indians.
Yes, at the leadership level, we've had prominent Indians on the board of trustees. In terms of student flows, there's a couple of thousand Indian students at USC, mostly at the graduate schools. And the business school, the Marshall School of Business, has run a course on India for many years. We call Prime, Doing Business in India. And it's a semester-long course that culminates in a group of 30 students going to India and having done some research on the various Indian companies, then meeting with the executives and talking to them there.
Awesome. Thank you.
Now, of course, we all worry that with the U.S. consulates closed in India for visas, what will happen in the coming year. And we hope that the back is broken of the pandemic in India quickly, and so that the embassies and the consulates will reopen the visa windows.
Absolutely. We're very hopeful that that will happen sooner rather than later, but certainly this will go on for a little while. So let me turn to Ravi Tilak. And Ravi, can you tell us a little bit about your business and your involvement in India? You have to unmute yourself. Ravi, we can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself.
But okay, it was, now you can hear me.
Yes.
Our business is to supply aluminum, aerospace, and defense grade alloy making process equipment and technologies all over the world. And so India being a large market, naturally we are there. More in a wholesome way, I would say. We started a relationship with a very large corporation in India to manufacture these alloys over there jointly with this company for benefit of ISRO and DRDO and several other Indian establishments.
Yeah, DRDO being the Defense Research
The
Development
Defense Research and
Organization, which is
Development
like
Organization.
you
Correct.
know, the R&D part of the India's Ministry of Defense.
Very true. Yeah, yeah. And ISRO stands for the Indian Space Research Program, which is similar to NASA of USA.
Exactly. Okay. Then we have Praful Kulkarni with the prettiest background among all of us, and those are his, you know, his company's pieces of work. On the top, you'll see the control tower for LAX, and his company has participated in the building of the extension of the Tom Bradley terminal. And there's another building from India, which I'll let Praful talk about. And Praful, tell us some of the iconic buildings you've done here in the US as well as in India.
Well, what you see, hello everyone. What you see to my right is the Jacobs Medical Center tower that is actually on the campus of University of California, San Diego. And it is an iconic structure, which has won several awards for patient care and how it was designed. To my left is actually a regional headquarters for TCS in India. And the company
TCS being Tata Consultancy Services, a company with 400,000 employees, of which at least 100,000 are here in the US today.
That is correct.
Yeah.
And so our relationship to India goes back to 2001, nearly 10 years after India opened up. I'm an architect by training, and my passion has always been architecture and construction. And I'm a principal with Canon Design. Canon Design is over 1,200 people internationally. We have offices in North America, in Canada, US, as well as in India. And our India staff is very capable of doing some wonderful work, which actually started in kind of a low-tech, translating hand-drawn or hard drawings into CAD. And now it is a full-fledged operation. In India, we have done a number of projects for the Tata Trust, which are hospital projects. That's one of our specialties. And we work seamlessly with India. And this is an exciting opportunity for us, all of us, to talk about how we can further this relationship between US and India, which is a wonderful opportunity for all of us.
Thank you, Praful. So, Ravi, you and I have talked about how the relationship between the two countries is growing and what might be the limitations or the hidden problems that limit the growth of this relationship. It's gone from 15 billion to 150 billion. You know, India was the 23rd largest trading partner to the US. Now it is among the top 10, maybe the 9th largest trading partner. What's holding it back, Ravi? You have some special insights on that.
See, the relationship happens on three fronts, country to country relationships. One is a government to government relationship. One is corporations to corporations relationships. And one is people to people relationship. So it's very heartwarming to see that this relationship between India and US are in sync on all these three fronts, which is very rare. You can have the only fourth front on which it is trying to come into synchronization is the culture front. And what I mean by culture front is the front regarding mannerisms, diet likings, as well as the breadths of languages and the expressions and the styles and the moving of your head and acknowledging things and how often you say thank you and how often you take thank you for granted. So these cultural relationships are getting developed, but the other three relationships are pretty much on a well-developed path, in my opinion.
Right, excellent. That's a wonderful point that you make, Ravi. Some of you might know that I wrote a book called Doing Business in 21st Century India. and it was published 1 year after the same publisher, Warner Books, had written a book on China, and they said, follow the exact same formula. And I said, no, I can't, because India is very different from China. And one of the things I did was move up the chapter on cross-cultural communication right to the front of the book. Because most Americans, when they think about Indians, they think about their Indian doctor or the Indian motel where they have stayed at, and say, hey, I could communicate with Dr. Patel, so I must be able to communicate with people in India. Whereas when I go to China, I don't speak the language and I need an interpreter. And my point was that while Indians may speak English, they really don't think American. And to make that bridge, is very, very important, because you can hear the words, you can hear the sentences, but you may not get the hidden meaning behind what people are saying. So that cross-cultural gap, I think, is very important to fill. And you will see, if you, we won't get into a lot of detail, but this whole business about hydroxychloroquine being shipped from India to the US is a great example of cross-cultural miscommunication. Okay,
Well,
where
no, I will say it's a great example of the government to government relationship happening in parallel with the person to person relationship also happening.
yes,
You should applaud the audacity with which the US president had the nerve to demand these medicines from him. Now, only a friend can demand things from a
yeah,
friend.
yes,
You see,
yes,
so I see a lot of cross bridging happening, and the same thing is with the corporations. If you look at John Chambers, what he has to offer is fantastic. He's almost saying, hey, American companies, reinvent your way, you reinvent yourself now the Indian way.
right. John Chambers being the former CEO of Cisco,
Exactly.
and when he was CEO, he did something very unusual. He established Cisco 2 as the Indian location. So equal headquarters in Bangalore and in Santa Clara for one of the world's largest companies.
Yeah.
And since he has retired from Cisco, he has taken a very active interest in developing the US-India relationship through an organization that he and others have created. Uh, Praful, where do you see the relationship between the two countries going? And is this crisis bringing the two countries closer together or further apart?
I have a perspective on this. At heart, I am all for liberal democracies. And that's why I think it's a natural partnership between the US and the United States. We currently have pretty strong leaders in Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. And they are friends. And they are decisive. And they make certain decisions that we may not all agree with. And both of them have had those kind of issues, but they are decisive. And they have a bonhomie between the two of them. And I believe that we need to take advantage of that situation. Because we are democracies, these leaders may be gone in a few years, someone else may be elected. So while the relationship is good between these two people, we have to deepen this relationship. And you talked about the malaria medication, where India initially said, no, we need all this medication. As we all know, India is a leader in pharmaceuticals, especially in the generic drug industry. And this medicine has been around for some time. Though having that relationship, like Ravi said, is actually a good thing, where friends can demand things from other friends. So the ban has been partially lifted. So I see that kind of relationship evolving, and how we can further these bonds that we really started to open in the late 60s.
Excellent. Roman, what is your perspective on this? Where do you see the relationship going, given that you've been going back and forth between the two countries for so long?
So I very much share Praful's perspective that liberal democracy is something that unites the two countries. And in fact, After the Second World War, when the Cold War started, India and the United States went kind of separate ways, I would say, but it was always in the natural order of things that they should be much closer. And I think when the Cold War ended and India started to liberalize, two events that coincided in time, it was natural for the U.S. to get closer to India. Now, it took a long time for that to lead to the current relationship with the numbers that you mentioned at the beginning, $150 billion of trade and a huge amount of FDI, which, by the way, goes both ways. It's also the case that Indian companies invest in the U.S. economy.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the company that Ravi's company is working with, has made almost a $6 billion investment in buying one of the world's largest aluminum companies here in the U.S., Novelis,
Yeah.
which is now owned by one of the largest business houses in India. Most Americans don't realize it, and this is the phenomenon that I describe as India Inside. That a lot of things are happening in the U.S. that have a connection to India that the average person doesn't even realize is the case.
I teach my students about Indian multinationals now, and I provide a list that I think BCG put together of multinationals in the world. And what you see when you look at time is how how many new Indian multinationals are making the list. But so I think that's the broad context, of that Indian-U.S. economic relations we're always going to get closer, and we're seeing that happen. At the same time, I think we have to be lucid about some of the obstacles that still exist in the relationship, and maybe that this is something we can talk about. There are some issues, and there are not many, and they're certainly not as severe as, say, in the U.S.-China economic relationship, but there are some issues that are points of contention and disagreement, and those are things on which the two leaders currently are working. Some of them are anecdotally kind of interesting to discuss, like the dispute that they had over the importation of Harley-Davidson motorcycles, where India was imposing a 75% tariff on those motorcycles, and Trump called Modi and got the tariff down to 50%, and then concluded the conversation saying that's not enough, should be lower than that. We impose no tariffs on Indian motorcycles, which I don't think the U.S. imports too many of, but maybe they should, because I think India is one of the largest, if not the largest, maker of motorcycles in the entire world. So there are some issues, and beyond this anecdote, there are issues having to do with agricultural products, with increasingly now tech. There are issues with foreign direct investment, and maybe those are some things we can discuss.
Right. Thank you so much,
Gunjan, I thought I would add this piece to the conversation that obviously India is still a developing country, and U.S. is the largest economic power, military power. And just to kind of put things in context, when the British finally left India in 1947, the average lifespan was 35 years for Indians. The illiteracy was in the 82-83% range, and the population was 350 million. So when you start to look at how much progress has been made since 1947, but it is still a developing country. It is barely getting into the middle income country. And that means they need to protect certain industries while opening up the markets, getting new technologies. And obviously there are areas in India that have done very, very well. Software and IT sectors, all the major tech companies are there. But there needs to be some patience between a developed, large economy and a developing economy.
Yeah, point taken, absolutely. Now, Richard, I know that you founded the International Business Center Cyber at USC many years ago, and you have extensive dealings with economies all across Asia. I'd love to get your perspective on what might be done to improve business between the US and India. You travel to Asia many times a year yourself. I used to speak at your Asia Pacific Business Outlook conference for about 15 years at USC. So give us your perspective, Dick, on what you think should happen, what India should do, what the US should do. Can you unmute yourself, please? Yeah.
I think without any particular policy changes, US firms are going to be, as a result of the COVID pandemic and as a result of the US-China trade war of the last year or so, are going to be diversifying some of their supply sources out of out of China, excuse me, to other places. And we've seen that already with Vietnam and the Philippines and Taiwan moving certain operations there as a result of the trade war. But as a result of the COVID-19, I think firms are going to think we want to have at least two or three different supply sources for parts of our supply chain. So I think that will happen naturally. The thing about doing more business in India, one of the issues is, of course, that thousands and thousands of Indians, top Indian students study in the United States, but very few of them go home. And so the difference between India and China is that so many of the Chinese students, after graduating from our business school or engineering school, go back home to China, and then they are a natural link to the United States for doing business because they've studied and worked and learned here, they've made connections here, and they are a natural link to accelerate that. It does not happen with Indian students, and I don't know if it will in the future, but that's a different pull that we have.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to invite the audience to start sending in questions. We've received a few questions. We will get to those momentarily. And in the meantime, we are going to switch to talking about politics a little bit. And I want to start with something that US policymakers began doing maybe 6 or 8 years ago. You know, that part of the world is often referred to historically as the Asia Pacific region. Asia Pacific including most of the countries in Asia, you know, Japan, China, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, India, the ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia, and then Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, right? But US strategists began using a different term, starting with the Defense Department and then going on to the State Department. And they now refer to that region as the Indo-Pacific. Okay. Very specifically, you will see repeated mentions of the word Indo-Pacific, which almost did not occur at all in US State Department or US Defense Department language 8 or 10 years ago. And there's a very definite reason why they are doing this, but I'll let our panelists kind of address that. It has caused some controversy, at least in one other major country in that part of the world. So Roman, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I mean, I think rhetoric tends to follow big political trends, and this is one in which the U.S.-China relationship was, had more tensions, and where there was a lot of closeness between the U.S. and India, and so the substitution of the word Asia, by the word Indo, is sort of a symbol of that renewed emphasis on the U.S.-India relationship, in a context where the U.S.-China relationship is showing, much more tension than in the past. Certainly, the contrast with the early 2000s, when China obtained permanent trading, privileges in the U.S. and then subsequently entered the WTO. We're a long way from that now. In the current political environment, something like that would probably not occur. Irrespective of who's in power, I think there's a broad political consensus on, adopting a much more antagonistic stance toward China. And so you're seeing this change of emphasis, and I think that this is an instance where the rhetoric follows the geopolitics.
Yeah. Ravi, I know that you have connections into the Indian political machine at the highest levels, to put it mildly. What is the reaction in India to this term, uh, Indo-Pacific? Do Indian planners like it? Do they embrace it? And how are they reacting to China's pushback on that term?
Well, the pushback has been answered logically. There is a large body of water in that part of the world, which is called Indian Ocean. So anything that is connected with Indian Ocean naturally needs to be termed as Indo-Pacific region of the world. And after that argument was given, everybody has calmed down overall.
Okay, good. So now the broader political factors between the two countries, the US and India, and how we have to, of course, talk about the elephant in the room now, COVID-19 as well. But for a moment, can Praful, can you address the issues about the political alignment between the two countries? What's good, what's not?
Well, I believe that the Indo-Pacific region is really the US attempt to form an alliance with India, Japan, Australia. These are the three larger partners in the area.
Right. They call
And
it the Quad.
exactly. And it is important that these, again, liberal democracies need to start building a stronger network. And if there are issues about, for example, this whole Huawei 5G situation between United States and China, where there is this allegation that there is surveillance going on through 5G. So creating these supply chains within the liberal democracies, I think, is an important aspect of this relationship. And I believe that if you look at the logic of it, it makes sense that you need to have these alternate supply chains in situations that we're looking at.
Got it. Okay, let me start addressing some of the questions that have come in. And again, I invite the audience to send in more questions. So we have a question from Yifei Sun relating to COVID. Why does India have such a low number of confirmed cases? Could you offer some insights into this issue? The number of cases in India is in the low thousands, I think. Uh, Anybody want to take that question?
Well, nobody's a doctor here, so anybody's guess is as good as mine. And I will give my marks to turmeric and to the diet and to the natural immunity that Indian spices are able to build within a person's body.
Absolutely. Everything my grandmother used to say, and she only had a 4th grade education, seems to be coming true. Uh, don't shake hands. It's a dirty practice. Wash your hands before and after a meal. Eat lots of turmeric, maybe some garlic. All of these things are now being validated by Western science. So yes, absolutely, there's a dimension to that. But also, I think there's another dimension, that the amount of testing that has been done in India is very, very low. And I'm personally involved in that, so I can tell you that that is a factor. Now, the Supreme Court of India this morning ruled that the government must offer free testing to everybody who wants it. So they cannot charge, nobody can be charged for a COVID-19 test. And I imagine that this will create, a fairly large number of tests, and the number of positive cases will go up. As you know, many people can have COVID-19 and never even realize that they did. So some of that will start to come out. So I'm sure the numbers will start to rise. I don't know how much they will rise. That's something hard to say. It's hard to practice social distancing in a country which is 9 times the population density of the United States, and the cities and the slums of India are much, much more dense. So there's there's a potential risk there that I think we will see play out very soon. Uh,
Gunjan,
the
if I may add, I think that
please.
one thing, there are several factors that both can lead to serious concerns about the future of the epidemic in India, and in particular, the density, as you mentioned, of the population, which makes transmission so much easier, and also the fact that there are lots of people that have respiratory problems because of the air pollution that might also create sources of concern. On the other hand, on the flip side of that, there's also a very youthful population. And so perhaps the fatality rate might be lower than in places like Italy that have a much higher percentage of the population that is, older. And another factor might be the coming heat of the summer, because I think I've seen quite a bit of evidence in the scientific literature that this particular virus is quite sensitive to heat, and that might help stem the overall spread. So I think it's anyone's guess where it's going to go, but and there are risk factors as well as alleviating factors, but it's a situation that's quite specific. Perhaps we could think about and talk about the government's policy response to the situation, and try to evaluate it. I don't know if this is something you want to also discuss.
Gunjan, I may add that if it is true that heat does resist the virus in the way that Roman is talking about, the fundamental issue in India is India only spends about 1% of its GDP on healthcare. So if things should really go awry, I think we could have a catastrophe. And we just hope that these other factors would come in where 50% of the population is under 26, the heat situation, and as well as, I mean, India can obviously produce a lot of pharmaceuticals. There are certain other strengths that are there, but it potentially is a worrisome prospect if the disease is as prevalent as it has been in the Northern Hemisphere. It's a worrying prospect.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just looking at the questions here. There's a question from somebody that we all might know on this panel, Dr. David Carl. He's struck by how optimistic we are about the relation between the two countries. And he says, are we being too rosy? Dr. Carl is associated with USC for a number of years, and somebody I respect. So would someone give a response to his question?
Well, I'll give it a shot one time. And Roman, you can talk about this. You probably study more than I do in this area. But if you look at this, if you go back to India's posture after independence, it was a non-aligned country. So it really didn't want to be in the Soviet-Russian sphere, nor in the NATO or US allied sphere. And the relationship between US and India it was very rocky through the 70s. And now where it is, I mean, you can tell the difference. So I'm an optimist by nature, and I believe that trend continue because of the natural affinities that we talked about.
Yeah, let me just return to the questions about COVID-19. There's a couple of interesting suggestions from the audience. We talked about how India has such a high rate of malaria, which is why India produces the largest amount of the anti-malarial drug. But there's another disease which is very common in India, and that's tuberculosis. And because of tuberculosis being so common, it's the vaccinations, the VCG vaccine that is given to limit tuberculosis is quite common in India. And there's, a couple of our audience members are hypothesizing whether that vaccination might also be a factor in producing immunity for COVID-19. I have not seen any literature on this. I have not seen any evidence of this, but that's an interesting hypothesis. Let's see if there are any other questions on the COVID-19 subject, and then we'll switch to other factors if we can. There's some redundancy in the question, so I'm not going through all of them. So let's move on to some other topics that that people have brought up here. Somebody is asking about the Sino-India Special Economic Zone. How does India think of its economic relationship with China? Anybody have a viewpoint on that? India has a tremendous amount of trade with China. It used to be roughly balanced until recently, and then Chinese imports have continued to rise. But I haven't heard of a Chinese-Indian Special Economic Zone. Can someone address that question?
Well, the border between China and India is not very conducive of establishing such a joint economic zone, whereas border between Pakistan and China offers that possibility. All the supply chain routes, if you were to establish such a zone, go through high altitudes and treacherous mountains. So I don't see, unless it's a fully captive special economic zone in one country and having its satellite zone in another country.
Right, yeah. And that's kind of what the IT service companies in India are doing. They're setting up operations in Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, whether it's Tata Consultancy or Mahindra or Cognizant, they all have significant operations in China. And then the Chinese companies, the Chinese telecom companies have significant operations in India because they are using Indian programmers to be able to develop the next generation of their products. So that's both of those trends are certainly going on in parallel with the growing US-India relationship.
See, the US-India relationship, I have a different slant on it. If you, and Professor asked, why is it so rosy in the opinion of this panel? And I could say that, US and India are like long lost brothers of Mother England. There is abundance of English being spoken among the intelligentsia on both sides. So when language doesn't continue to act as a barrier, and democracy prevails in both places, naturally the relationship has to keep growing on a day-by-day basis. So it won't be too optimistic to say that all the countries which are the Commonwealth countries are likely to have, and today performing democracies are likely to have very strong ties with United States in years ahead. And India is just one of those.
Yeah, that's a great point. We have another question about philanthropists and nonprofits and high net worth individuals. How are they stepping up to address the needs created by COVID-19? I'm not sure if the questioner is asking this in the context of people within India or people within the US or going across borders. Anybody want to take that question?
I guess part of it anyways. We basically have, the US model for philanthropy is well known in terms of the tax benefits that come through philanthropy. Whereas in India, that has not been the case over the years. So that is a newer practice. So there are differences, but it needs to be bridged. Now, of course, the Tata Trust, for example, they set these trusts up some time ago, and those have been highly endowed, and they are stepping forward. So I believe that the tax structure needs to change, or the incentives need to change in India, so that people who are wealthy can use the same model that we currently use in the United States.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now, I should point out that Praful mentioned the Tata Trust. So the Tata companies, there's 91 of them, and the Tata family itself owns less than 1% of them. Most of the stock was donated to these charitable trusts. And if you look at the Tata.com website, they use some very unusual language to describe themselves. They say they are capitalist in function, but socialist in nature. I challenge you to find those words on the website of any American company. Okay. And immediately following the COVID-19 crisis, they have jumped in, the Tata companies have jumped in at every possible level to be able to help their local communities and to help the country at large. The other very prominent uh, person that I should mention is Azim Premji, the founder and chairman of Wipro, which is one of India's largest IT services companies. His foundation has done a tremendous amount of charitable work and has also stepped forward to help out in the COVID-19 crisis. Now, here in the United States, where we have 3 million people of Indian origin living in the United States, there are many examples. I get the India West newsletter every day, and there are countless examples of how entrepreneurs, hotel owners, small business people, volunteers have stepped forward to help their local communities, to be able to donate personal protective equipment, to be able to do all kinds of things, to be able to step forward and take an active role in dealing with this crisis. So I think there's plenty happening. Obviously, could more happen? Yes. It's not like everything that could be done has been done. But that's a great question, Ken.
I can
You have
jump
another
in perhaps.
question about,
Gunjan,
yes.
I want to add also, so a lot of the philanthropic efforts to fight this pandemic takes the form of research into a vaccine or into treatments that ultimately will apply the world over. And there, the Gates Foundation in the US has played a huge role, with Bill Gates devoting billions of dollars to funding the opening of several vaccine manufacturing plants, knowing full well that he may not, that some of them will actually not be used because the vaccine won't be effective, but taking this risk, of funding 6 or 7 of those plants in the hopes that 2 of them will actually come online and be ready when the vaccine is approved for mass production, so that it can then be, diffused. And I would add to that people, and particularly with reference to India right now, are very concerned about the economic consequences of the lockdown, and particularly its effects on the poorest portion of the population. It's about a quarter of the Indian population, last I checked, that lives on less than $2 a day, and widespread pandemic that would lead to a closure of the country will have pretty dramatic effects on their livelihoods. And so, you could even think about moving below the level of subsistence. And so a lot of NGOs are now trying to prepare for this. I know that in the economics community, there are lots of development economists that are worrying about this possibility, that it's not only the health effects of the COVID pandemic, but it's the indirect effects of the closure that comes to fight it on people's ability to secure food and basic necessities. So I think you're seeing already people mobilize in the global development community to try to address this, or at least preemptively have a plan in place on what to do. And just yesterday, I was reading plans from various centers on global development. The one based at the London School of Economics has a very detailed plan, specifically tailored to developing countries, and particularly to India, because they have a lot of involvement there.
Right, absolutely. Thank you for that, Roman.
You know,
We
there
have
are
another
several
question. Yes.
US-India based non-profit organizations also, which are stepping up their efforts as we speak to support this interim time when, as Roman mentioned, the heat is felt more by those daily wage earners who are absolutely out of work because of this. And America India Foundation is one, Akshay Patra Foundation of America is another one, which has several kitchens all over India and is making food and distributing it to people, especially to the migrant worker community of India.
Right, right. And I know, Ravi, that your wife is actively involved in supporting, this massive effort to feed millions of
Yes,
people,
yes.
school children
They,
on a regular basis, and now these migrant workers
yeah.
who are essentially stranded
Yeah,
as a
when the
result
schools
of the
are
shutdown.
closed, when the schools are closed,
Yeah,
they have to become the beneficiaries of these midday meal programs,
right.
and that activity is being carried out uh, at military level, really, right now, which is fantastic.
Yeah. So for those of you who are not familiar with Akshay Patra, it's a non-profit organization that started in India, and it runs industrial scale kitchens to feed school children. And
Two
the
million a day.
idea is that many children of poor parents may not attend school and be forced to work, but if they are going to get a good hearty meal at school, then they are likely to show up in school every day. And it's just been a massive effort all across the country. Their kitchens are run at Six Sigma quality and producing nice, healthy, wholesome food. And it's been expanding pretty much all across the country. So it's a lot of the funding comes from U.S. donors, some
Yes.
Indian Americans, some companies that match their funding, and so on. And it's been a remarkable phenomenon to see that. So thank you so much for bringing that up, Ravi. We have another question from an attendee about the spread of misinformation, comparing what happens in India versus the USA. Um, WhatsApp groups in India are often the source of very rapid spread of fake news, similar to what we've seen here in the US on Facebook over the last several years. Uh, so, is there a scope of collaboration between the US and India on this particular issue? So, let me give you my perspective. If you look at how Facebook is trying to track down fake news, they're actually deploying thousands of people in India actually watching those posts and those forums. And because Facebook itself is a forum where you can watch those things and kind of tame them, it's much easier to do. WhatsApp, however, is end-to-end encrypted, so only the sender and the recipient get to see what is being sent. So it's a much harder technically to control that. Now, the Indian government has tried to step in many times, and particularly in sensitive political areas, they shut down the internet periodically, which has its own issues. I don't know that there's a specific technical solution, but really the US and India are already working together because the nature of this media business brings the two countries together with their workforces. Does anybody want to add to that further?
Well, I'm not aware, besides, of course, the technical collaboration that's going on between the software companies. And as you mentioned, there are literally hundreds of thousands of Indians who are looking at this material and advising companies in the US. But I do want to talk a little bit about free democracies and the freedom to say things and do things, and what the technology allows us to do. Those problems are no different in India than they're here. In fact, sometimes they're worse in India because not everyone's level of education is as high as it is in the United States. And these are serious problems that governments have to deal with without getting into draconian measures or getting into an autocratic model that China has. So it's an evolving situation that will continue to be worked on an ongoing basis.
Absolutely. So we are going to speed up the thing because there's only 5 minutes left. Uh, there's a question from the audience, which has an assumption built in. For years, India resisted globalization. Will the current pandemic reverse the trend towards integration in the world economy? Well, so if you take the long perspective, India was global 2000 years ago. India was India was trading with the rest of the world very vigorously before the British showed up and locked up the trade and set up the monopoly of the East India Company. Indians, by their very nature, Indian entrepreneurs and Indian business people, by their very nature, are globalists. Indians live in Africa and and South America and the United States, and they carry this trading gene with them wherever they go. The slowdown in this really happened after India became independent and had a very strong socialist government with Prime Minister Nehru. But after 1991, the country has begun to open up and open up vigorously. So if you drive a Jaguar, you're driving an Indian car today. If you take tetracycline, or if you take any painkiller, aspirin or acetaminophen, chances are that it was produced in India. I'm with Kaiser, and most of my medications, my diabetes medication from Kaiser is actually produced in India. So there's a tremendous amount of globalization happening. But unlike the globalization from China, which is very visible at Walmart, the globalization from India is not so visible. When India buys the C-17 aircraft, only Boeing and a few other people know about it, right? India is the largest importer of weapons and equipment in the world. And today, the United States is the largest source of this for India. So a lot is happening, but you don't see it at Walmart. You don't see it, at the grocery stores. And that's why people sometimes don't realize it. There's a lot of questions about the next US presidential election. I'm going to avoid those because we can't tell what's going to happen in those elections. So I'm not ignoring those questions, but I don't think this panel can actually address them in a meaningful manner. The So final question, what specific industries are impacted? What specific industries are impacted by the US-India trade agreement initiated by Trump? Or is it to have no impact? I'm not sure what India-US trade agreement this person is referring to, but in general, can you answer the question of which industries will see better trade between the two countries based on what has happened recently? Ravi, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. I think the finance industry is going to be the most impacted, and I'll tell you why. In order to foster trade, from US side at least, a US seller needs a financial guarantee from his buyer in India. And when the Indian buyer tries to give him the financial guarantee by opening a letter of credit in favor of the US seller, that letter of credit remains negotiable only at certain banks in USA. And those banks are restricted to be the banks which are under direct control of the government of India. So if the trade between US and India is going to foster a big deshackling, or a huge agreement has to happen between the two countries on the way the financial guarantees from a buyer and seller will be recognized and accepted by the seller. The seller is not going to step up, taking a huge amount of open credit and then go to the US Exim Bank to cover it and all those things. It has to happen through commercial banking channels. But that can happen only if the trade negotiations will unlock that security the Indian government puts on its banks.
Absolutely. I think that's a really valid point. I mean, if you want to sell to the Indian Ministry of Defense, you almost have to be with the State Bank of India. And, it's not necessarily the only choice that American companies want to consider. So it works on the flip side as well. The final question from an anonymous attendee saying, if you were to pick which relationship is most important to India in the next 10 years, would it be the United States or would it be China? And I think I can speak for our panel on this question, that it would, from India's perspective, it would definitely be the United States on all fronts, political, business, cultural. If anybody disagrees with me on that, please tell me your reasons. I think we would all want to know that.
Well, I'd like to kind of say that you cannot ignore China.
Of course.
You still have to create another relationship. Probably it's not, sometimes one wonders if it is actually more critical than the US relationship, because it is a whole different form of government. But The number one, I agree with you, the relationship between US and India, but India also needs to develop sufficiently positive relationship with China.
Absolutely.
I can jump in. I think that I'm not sure which one is more important, but I'm more confident in predicting that the U.S.-India relationship will be much more harmonious than the India-China relationship.
Got it. Okay. Well, thank you, panelists. Roman Bakshar, Praful Kulkarni, Ravi Tilak, you've been wonderful. Dick Drobnik, thank you so much for chairing the Asia Society and for making this event possible. I hope the audience got some good value. Now, most of us can be found on LinkedIn. So if you have a burning question for me or for any of the panelists, probably the best place to start would be to send us a message on LinkedIn. And Dr. Drobnik has some final words for us. Go ahead. Unmute yourself, please, Richard.
Yeah, I also want to thank the panelists. I enjoyed this evening and I learned quite a bit, and that's always a goal in these things. So thank you to Gunjan yourself, to Ravi, to Roman, and to Praful. And I want to thank our co-sponsors, TIE, the Indus Entrepreneur Association of Southern California, and of course the Alumni Association of Indian Institutes of Technology. Now I want to give our panelists and our viewers a gift, a 3-minute gift that's going to happen right now that you will all enjoy and be inspired by. And it's a short, remarkable video that was produced over the weekend to honor the doctors, nurses, and first responders who are all on the front lines of the war on the pandemic. This video was produced over the weekend by a member of the Asia Society Southern California's board, Dr. Siegel Sung, and with many, many helpers and students and so on and so forth. It's titled, "We Are in This Together." Lee or Anjali, would you please play it?
We are together. Today's another day. Pain has gone away. Bring myself to say goodbye. All the tears I've cried. Sun rising in the sky. And slowly time goes by. Finally find a way to give a meaning to our life. Today I wanna feel the squeeze on my skin. The time has come to say hello. It's in your feelings inside. Sometimes you have to dream and forget everything. But never stop looking for hope. That's everything you need. Come together, we can find a way. Love that pulls me to the sun and sky. Come, spread your wings and fly away. Thank you.